So this is the European Association for Language Testing and Assessment, EALTA, and you can find the website there at ealta.eu.org. If you're not a member already, please do sign up to be a member or an associate member, even for people outside of Europe. That is possible, and it is free. And there are lots of resources on the EALTA website that you can take advantage of. This particular SIG was founded in 2022, so it's quite new, last year. So the conveners are myself, Asmira Chispaibi, and Gemma Bellhouse, my colleague who's going to be talking a little bit later on. We both work in assessment at the British Council. I work in test research, and Gemma works in test production and quality assurance. And we set up this SIG last year because we felt that there was a need, and particularly within Europe, within EALTA, for this kind of special interest group. We know that there are similar groups attached to other organizations, but there's nothing quite like this for EALTA. So we created this group for the benefit of people who make tests, test providers, administrators, general educators, so those who just have an interest in assessment, and also particularly for researchers as well, who make up a very large proportion of EALTA. And our ultimate aim, as you can see there, is to provide greater opportunity, greater fairness in assessment, make our test taker experiences more richer and more rewarding, and ultimately
Richard, you're not sharing the screen anymore, actually.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry. Can you see that now?
Yes, great, thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. So our aim is to ultimately contribute to more inclusive societies and help assessment to contribute to that. And our kind of shorter term aim in this particular SIG, our more specific aim, is to provide a forum for discussion of developments in assessment, provide a forum for sharing knowledge, and also to increase transparency in assessment practices. And this is with particular reference to special accommodations, which are provided widely in the assessment field, and also other general inclusive practice in test development, and ensuring the inclusion of previously marginalized groups to make sure that everybody can take advantage of the opportunities that assessment, when it's done well, can provide. So this afternoon we are going to have 3 papers. So we will start in a moment with Professor Judit Kormos from Lancaster University, and then we will be welcoming Tony Clark from Cambridge University Press and Assessment. Then we'll have a short break, 10-minute break, and then we will see Joanna Nijakowska from the University of Warsaw and Dina Tsagari from Oslo Metropolitan University. So 3 very great presentations that we're really looking forward to. Following that, we will have a chance for some discussion, particularly about guidelines for equality, diversity, and inclusion in the field of assessment, what we have, maybe what we need going forward, and what we think may be useful. And then we'll finish about 1:15. Is being recorded. We are planning to have our speakers can use their 30 minutes however they wish. Usual protocol is to have about 20-25 minutes of presentation, followed by a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes for questions. So please, as you watch the presentations, please use the chat for your comments and your questions. Unless you are presenting, please stay muted and cameras off during presentations. If there are any links or resources that you would like to share with us which are relevant to the presentations, then please use the chat to share that and react as you would like. So I'll hand you over now to Gemma, who will introduce our first speaker.
Great, thanks, Richard. Welcome, everybody, and it's great to see your face, Judit, again. It's wonderful to have you. Thanks for joining us today. So you'll be beginning and talking about key considerations in investigating accessibility and adjustments for test takers with specific learning difficulties. I'll just remind everybody to please use the chat to ask your questions and go ahead and talk to each other, add your comments, and Judit will use any time at the end to answer those questions. And if there are any leftover questions, those questions could then be answered at the very end of the session today. So I will go ahead and mute myself and turn over to you, Judit.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Richard and Gemma, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to talk about accessibility and adjustments for test takers with specific learning difficulties to this distinguished group of EALTA members, scholars, and other members of the audience. So in this research, or in this presentation, I'm going to highlight the importance of the topic, and I think I'm actually preaching to the converted because you came, you must have come because you are interested in accessibility and inclusion. But why particularly students with specific learning difficulties who are my area of research and interest? And the reason is that a lot of students, actually the proportion varies country by country, overall between 10–15% of our student and test taker population has some kind of specific learning difficulty, including dyslexia. And we know that the needs and the abilities of students with SPLEs need to be taken into account in assessment, not just in our classrooms and teaching, so that they are not unfairly disadvantaged in these contexts. And this is part of the general initiative to develop and validate and design fair tests for every student, so that we can provide a fair and ethical assessment for a wide variety and a very diverse group of test takers in this super diverse 21st century context. So what my talk is going to cover is a short overview of the concepts of fairness, universal design, accommodations, and modifications. Then I'm just very briefly going to describe some characteristics of specific learning difficulties and issues in identifying test design and test administration conditions. Then to start us off, thinking about how we can perhaps develop guidelines and ensure that both high stakes tests as well as our classroom tests are fair and accessible. I'm going to propose different research directions or questions to think about, and I'm going to show you that unfortunately there aren't easy answers, and there is still a lot to do in this area to come up with evidence-based suggestions and solutions. But I hope that these questions will inspire further discussion and perhaps also research in this field. And then I'll end with a summary. So I think it's important also for us as a team in the EALTA SIG to be clear about the principal characteristics of test fairness. And the issues of test fairness, as I have said, and as was argued in here already back in 2010 by Antoni Kuhnen, is inherently an ethical question. And when we ensure fairness in assessment, we really want to prevent that tests inflict harm on test takers, and we want to maximize the opportunities for test takers and candidates to perform to the best of their knowledge. So there are four basic characteristics or elements of fairness according to the Joint Committee of Standards of AERA and APA and NCME. These are the big organizations in educational research, in psychology. And these four main areas include the first one, which is fair and equitable treatment in the testing process. What does this mean? This first criterion means that we really have to consider carefully the context and the purpose of assessment, and to make sure that we provide students and candidates with appropriate conditions and procedures in which they take the test. The next one is fairness as the lack of absence of measurement bias. And this is partly also a question of test validation, because this means that we want to make sure that students who have similar abilities and have the chance to perform to the best of their knowledge, and there is no other element in our test that would result in particular groups of test takers scoring differently when their abilities are in fact similar. The next one, fairness as access to the constructs measured, expresses that all test takers should have equal opportunities to demonstrate their knowledge. And here, again, this is also a question of construct validity. We have to make sure that no other additional knowledge or components or skills are needed to perform the task than we actually intend to assess. And then finally, fairness as validity of individual test score interpretations for the intended use. Here again, we touch on issues of validity, actually predictive validity, namely that we have to ensure that the interpretations of the test scores for the intended use are valid across different test taker groups and do not disadvantage certain groups of candidates. So these are the major four guidelines, which are of course quite general, and the question is, how can we implement these in our assessments? There are some more practical ways of implementing these guidelines, and if we want to translate them, then we actually get to the principles of universal test design. And universal test design claims that tests should be constructed and administered more flexibly so that accommodations to students become unnecessary, so that we should actually design tests by default that are accessible to everyone, and then there is no need for providing accommodations. Of course, fully accessible tests are more like a dream, and a dream somewhere in the distant future, or maybe one. It's quite likely that students and candidates will still need some accommodations. Universal test design also means that we have to carefully examine the test construct and set tasks that avoid that some individual characteristics of test takers cause bias and result in construct irrelevant variance. And there are a couple of studies that have already looked into this, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about them soon. The concept of accommodations has already been mentioned. Some colleagues and other researchers prefer the term special arrangements, and that might be also the terminology used by some international testing organizations. So these accommodations or arrangements do not change the construct to be assessed. They modify, for example, the presentation format, the response format, the timing, and the test setting without having an impact on the construct that we assess. This can be extended time, for example. Modifications, and we have to sometimes provide modifications. So, for example, for visually impaired candidates, where we only perhaps use a portion of a test, a substitute test, or alternate means of assessment. And obviously, in this case, for example, there is an endorsement on the test certificate which says that the construct was modified. So some of these principles of universal design have been approached already and set up for general educational assessment nearly 25 years ago. And these are from the Center for Universal Design, who also proposed design principles for universal design principles for education. And they describe several principles that need to be considered when we construct assessment tasks. And the first one is equitable use, which means that test design is useful for people with diverse abilities. Flexible use, that the test design accommodates a wide range of individual students with their abilities. That the test should be simple and intuitive to use, that the information should be easily perceivable, readable, regardless of sensory abilities. And some of these conditions are not necessarily applicable to all language tests, because this one, the tolerance for error, means that there should be minimal hazards. So, for example, for a test of chemistry, this might be relevant. But for example, if you think about remote proctoring, there can be some hazards here, and we have to be careful about this. Low physical effort, again, may not be so much applicable to a language test, but we need to, for example, consider how long our test is and whether the fatigue effect interferes with the results. And then the size and space for approach. We have to ensure that there is appropriate space and size is provided for candidates to take the test and write their answers, etc. So these are the general educational design and testing design principles, and there is another set of principles which will be relevant when I talk about some expert judgments. This was proposed by Thompson a couple of years later, and he established 7 principles, and he discussed that it's really important to be inclusive when we consider our assessment population, to have precisely defined constructs in our tests, to have accessible and non-biased items, that we should construct tests that can be easily accommodated, simple and clear intuitive instructions and procedures, maximum readability and comprehensibility. So here this refers to the textual information, so that is presented in language. And the maximum legibility refers to the visual representation, so the images and the overall layout should be accessible to students. So these are the overall universal design principles. And let me now turn back to candidates, test takers with specific learning difficulties. What characterizes them? One of the key and most prevalent SPLDs is dyslexia, which is characterized by issues with phonological awareness, perceiving and manipulating sounds. And these abilities are key for literacy skills in one's language, and they do affect second language learning processes as well. Another factor is working memory, the ability to keep and manipulate information in short-term memory. The third one is naming speed. So the speed, for example, with which someone can retrieve vocabulary items, and it can also have consequences for speed of processing of verbal information. And then finally, executive functions such as attention, self-regulation, and these factors. Oh, somebody took the control back from me. Can I request control again? I don't seem to be able to present.
Nobody has control now, so you should be able to share again.
Okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes,
Yes, we
it's
can.
back.
Okay, good. Suddenly disappeared, right?
Not a
Okay.
problem. We can see it. Thank
Good, fine. All right. So these are the four characteristics or predictors of SPLDs, and you can imagine that these do affect test-taking processes and how students engage with our assessment tasks. Identifying SPLDs can be challenging because they vary in their degrees of severity. They are placed on a continuum of strengths and weaknesses, and also different types of SPLDs can occur. So we can see different kind of combinations of strengths and weaknesses, and that means that cutoff points for what constitutes an SPLD, how do we identify someone who's dyslexic, can be difficult to establish due to issues with norming. Where is the point where we see somebody is performing below the standard, above the standard? And if we consider multilingual countries where students, candidates, learners have multiple languages, a home language or several home language, another language that they speak in school, then the norms established for a monolingual population are not applicable. So then there can be issues around over-identification as well as under-identification. Also, identification systems vary country by country. Some countries have standardized tests, some no tests at all. Some countries use a variety of tests, etc. There are also high costs of identification. And I'm mentioning this because in order to qualify for accommodations, most testing organizations require an official certificate of SPLDs, and they very often require that it should be no older than 2 years old. However, SPLDs accompany someone for a lifetime, and for example, the cost of identifying dyslexia in the UK can be around £400. And if somebody was identified having dyslexia at the age of 16 and is taking a test at the age of 22, it's unlikely that their dyslexia has gone away, and they have to wait for the assessment and pay for the assessment again. So this is really important, I think, to consider for language testing organization, is if they want to make the adjustments accessible for their test takers. And then when we think about research, one possibility is not to use cutoff points, and we have done this in some of our studies, but you take a variety of predictor variables and then see how they interact with various test administration conditions. And when you do research, it is possible to then make inferences about what would be applicable to someone who has that particular underlying SPLD, right? So let me give you a brief overview of where I think research should focus and what research has already been done. So research approach number one, and this is the kind of quite traditional approach, or where we are making already some progress, is to examine the differential impact of testing adjustments on test scores with and without SPLDs or disabilities. and then see, are these adjustments useful? Do they result in improvement for those who need it? And what happens to students who don't have SPLD and they perform the test under the adjusted conditions? Because if they also perform better, then we need to modify our test and make it accessible, make it universally accessible for all the students, regardless of their SPLDs. So you can do this research with using official certificates, so have a population that has an official diagnosis of SPLDs, or use the continuous predictors of underlying cognitive skills and see how they interact with the testing condition. So we have done studies in this regard. One was on time extension in reading with the generous support of the British Council on the APTIS Young Learner test. We found no effect of time because the test was actually quite generously timed itself. We investigated read aloud for text comprehension, so that's already a modification, but in some contexts it is possible, particularly if we actually start considering text comprehension as a multimodal rather than a single modal construct. And we had positive effect for students with SPLDs, particularly if the input text was difficult. A more recent study where we examined the use of self-pacing in listening assessment for younger learners in Austria with Katrin Eberharten and colleagues with the Innsbruck team, we found no effect of self-pacing on listening scores for either students with or without SPLDs when they were considered on a continuous scale. So that's research approach number one, and it is really important to examine the impact of adjustments on scores. However, if we want to understand the construct and the impact of testing adjustments, we really shouldn't just focus on the scores themselves, because that's the ultimate product. We should also investigate what kind of test-taking strategies, processes students use when they perform a test task in terms of cognitive validity, and see if an adjustment actually changes the cognitive validity, the underlying testing processes that the students use when they have this adjustment at their disposal. And we can also examine the effect of testing adjustment on the affective factors such as anxiety, because we know that higher levels of anxiety will result in lower level test scores. And there is only one study so far that has done that, and that's a study we have conducted very recently with the Innsbruck team, and we found that self-pacing had a positive effect on anxiety for all candidates. No differences in strategy use in the two conditions, so it seems no impact on cognitive validity. And we found no relationship between how frequently students used self-pacing and their scores. So that's, again, it seems that self-pacing is probably not a construct, not a condition that interferes with the construct itself. But we found that those who have slow first language reading, they use self-pacing more. Not a very useful strategy, and that's why the students with SPLDs scored lower in the self-paced condition than in the single listening condition. So the third approach is to examine the differential impact of underlying cognitive variables on the test tasks, administration conditions, to detect any construct-irrelevant variance caused by these factors. So what we did, for example, we examined whether working memory interacts with different test types in the assessment of reading. In the TOEFL junior test of ETS, we found limited role of working memory. Then we examined the same question in the case of writing tests, and we found that in the editing tasks, low working memory students were disadvantaged. So their working memory seems to have been a construct irrelevant factor. Research approach number 4 is really important, as the work of Linda Taylor and her colleagues at Cambridge Assessment shows. We really need to conduct more qualitative interviews with stakeholders to understand what barriers they face, how this can be removed, how the special arrangements are used by the students, what other special arrangements students could try, and also what are the challenges from the perspective of the test providers in offering these special arrangements and overcoming them. And the last but one approach is the expert evaluation approach. And as I was preparing for this talk, I have found these really useful guidelines and skills that help us, or rubrics actually, help us evaluate to what extent a test meets the universal test design principles. And we can get experts to look at tests, rate them in terms of precisely defined construct, how amenable they are to accommodations, instructions, etc., and then make recommendations what test changes are needed based on this expert evaluation. And then finally, we really also need to consider the validity of individual test score interpretations for the future intended use and see what effect, for example, special arrangements have on the predictive value of test scores. For example, does a student who uses self-pacing in a listening assessment, will that student be successful in academic listening contexts? Or if we give this accommodation or adjustment, will they actually score lower or struggle in academic listening context? And we have to carefully analyze the target language use domain, the intended use, and then I also identify barriers and means of support in the target language use domain. So that actually already takes us back to teaching and the strong relationship between teaching and assessment. So let me conclude so that we have a few minutes for questions. So it's really important to consider the role of cognitive and first language literacy-related factors in designing test tasks and making decisions on test administration conditions. We should investigate interaction of test taker characteristics with the design features, as well as the differential impact of special arrangements for target and non-target group of test takers. And the impact should not just be the scores, but also test-taking processes, affective factors. And I think it's really important to consider the motto of the neurodiversity movement, nothing about us without us, and take the perspective of test takers and stakeholders into account. So thank you to all my collaborators over the past 10 years who have helped me with researching these issues, and I'm really looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Judit. That was an excellent presentation. It's very thorough, very detailed. And we do have a couple of questions coming through in the chat. There's still time if people want to put questions, please write your questions there. The first one was from Rosa Barrow. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She's asking about a deaf student who's doing a master's degree at her, I assume, university. And part of the course is about learning Arabic. And as she's deaf, they're removing the listening aspect of the Arabic assessment, but wondering about suggestions about potential alternative assessments that would allow them to assess knowledge of Arabic across the skills. She says, while maintaining some parity and fairness of assessment across her cohort. Would love to hear your views. The same student was unable to take IELTS because the overall band score couldn't be calculated. And experience with special accommodations with Aptis as well, we run into similar issues. And Emma Bruce, one of my British Council colleagues, also recommended in the chat taking the lip reading as an alternative. But yeah, I would be curious about your views of, alternative to exemption from a component. Is it better potentially to find another test or to take some sort of integrated test? Yeah, what are your views?
It's a really interesting and difficult questions, and thank you for the questions. I think maybe Tony will be better in the next presentation. He will be better able to address them. I don't know how much I should say about them. I mean, overall, I think, with regard to the lip reading test, we have to be very careful. That's where we might actually, again, create construct irrelevant variance. Not every deaf student is good at lip reading if they use sign language. So that might be actually harmful for many students. I think here we really have to consider, and I think first of all we might want to move towards multimodal assessment. And consider that text comprehension nowadays it does take place often in a single modal format, but a lot of the times can be multimodal. So, for example, for this deaf student, you can create a video with subtitles, right? Someone speaking, and then the subtitles are shown. So that's just one suggestion. Otherwise, so you have to take into account what is that the deaf student, where does the deaf student experience barriers, right? It's listening comprehension. And that's where you have to provide modifications and also consider the intended use of the test. And that's what I said. For a deaf student, the intended target language use domain is very unlikely to be non-adjusted spoken input, right? So if we have, for example, a deaf participant here and now, they should be seeing subtitles, right? So again, I think I think we should be able to calculate band scores and scores for these people, disregarding that component, and have that as an endorsement on their certificate. Because when they go to work, when they go to study, they will not be expected to demonstrate the skill. It's because of their disability, right? So that's kind of my answer to that. But I think Tony will talk more about it.
We can give Tony an opportunity a bit later. Thank you so much, Judit. And everybody feel free to use the reaction button at the top to give. And we'll now move directly on to Tony's presentation. So to share, hello, nice to see you. Welcome. So Dr. Tony Clark from Cambridge University Press and Assessment will be talking to us today about visually impaired learners and high-stakes testing accommodations, navigating and redressing power asymmetry. It's a lovely title. I will hand right over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Gemma. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you to Judith as well. I do normally work on IELTS, and I'm happy to come back to some of those questions because they are very important. What it's probably best to do is separate IELTS from this presentation, though. That's not what I'm talking about today. But yeah, definitely happy to discuss them later on. For today's topic, yeah, this is our title about visually impaired learners this time and high stakes testing, navigating and redressing power asymmetry. So just as a bit of background to the project, quite a long time ago now, I started my teaching career as an assistant in Hungary. So that's back in 2006. And I was working in a school, a special educational needs primary school for children with low vision. So they were up to 14 years old. They called it years 1 to 8. And it really was a very interesting school to be part of. There's a lot of good work going on in there. Obviously, they had a lot of challenges. It wasn't just pupils with low vision. It was a variety of other issues and disorders and more kind of complex needs. But we're going to focus mostly on the low vision element today. The school had a significant Roma cohort, and I mention that because it is relevant. I'm going to talk quite a lot about educational chances and life opportunities, and all these different elements do come into it. I got the good opportunity to work with a very, very experienced English teacher there, a local English teacher who specialised in low vision or teaching students with low vision and accompanying, complexities. I've called her Miss Modar in this presentation, but that's to protect her anonymity. But my role, basically, 2007, was to support her in the classroom as she taught these kids with multiple challenges. I did at the time learn a bit of Hungarian language. I think I got up to about B2 level. I mention that not to boast or anything like that. It's because it's relevant to what I'm about to talk about. But luckily, there's hopefully no one on this call who's going to test me on that because it's a bit rusty. This is a longitudinal study. So what I did was I worked as a teaching assistant, then I conducted the main study for today in 2010, and then I went back later on a bit more recently to see what had developed since then. So I think it's important to define a couple of our terms before we go forward. It's an important point that special educational needs may be defined differently between countries. So what one country, takes that to mean might well be different according to the financial context or any other educational aspect. The definition I've approximately gone for here, though, is to take it to mean that children or young people who have needs arising from disabilities or learning difficulties. And that was adapted from the Salamanca statement, which has evolved over the years. In terms of low vision in particular, it's kind of an interesting term. What I found is quite a lot of people understand what being blind means. That's quite clear. And they understand the opposite end of the spectrum, which is unimpaired sight. Where low vision falls is a bit more confusing. And I think that is probably because it's not, in direct contrast, but it's better thought of along a continuum. So I've put that on there. If you imagine low vision starting around about where the yellow on that arrow begins, it goes all the way to almost, completely or legally blind. You could summarize it as people with quite severe visual impairments, but within that, there's quite a broad spectrum, and that actually also affects educational chances as well. Low vision is also often accompanied by additional disorders, so it could be neurodevelopmental. A lot of the children in this study didn't develop in the way you would expect them to because of their eyesight problems, and then there are all kinds of knock-on effects of that. So it's quite unusual to have just low vision on its own. Also, it's been found that 60% of children with low vision do struggle with communication skills, and that's connected to their developmental issues. And you can imagine how difficult it is trying to learn another language, English in this case, if you're struggling to communicate in your first language. And again, going back to the countries, not every country same challenges. I come from Scotland. Nisbet works in Scotland, the man I've quoted here, and what he was saying in his research is that it's by no means sorted in a high-income country like that. There's a lot of work still to be done because accommodations are basically not fully adequate. That's for in the classroom and in a testing situation as well. So as we heard in the previous presentation, we know that candidate perspectives are really, really important to bring in to the learning process, to the test-taking process. These should be encouraged. What I found when I look back into the and French agrees with me, there's a tendency to look at what educational practitioners feel is best for the low vision learner. So could be teachers. It is important to hear what they have to say, and medical experts, you know, for example, doctors, about what's best for these children. But I think that's only telling part of the story. We really should ask the learners themselves. And additionally, I've put a special category here for the perspectives of Roma learners. You may or may not know, but a disproportionate amount or number of Roma learners end up in special educational needs education or institutions. And some of them probably do need that help, and some of them don't, but they're ending up in these institutions. I would see that as a form of exclusion, actually, from the mainstream educational culture. But again, that's a big topic, and it's not one that I could really go into in huge depth today, but it's very relevant as contextual background, I think. There should not be so many Roma learners in these schools, from what I can see. So power asymmetry in high stakes testing. We know that in any test, there is a bit of a power imbalance, and it's the candidate who ends up on the receiving end of that imbalance. Somebody's testing you on something and you have very little say in the outcomes or the judgment beyond your own performance. But if your performance is compromised by some kind of additional need, I think the power balance can shift even more. And if it's a high stakes test, it's particularly important to look at that. We know that low vision candidates, they have very diverse needs. And actually, I feel that this is an area that's under-researched, both at primary school and high school level, and also beyond it in the university setting. It'd be great to know more about low vision candidates. As mentioned, of course, we don't want to give too much of an advantage to candidates in a testing situation. We need to keep looking at the balance and make sure it's fair for everybody. So basically, we need further inquiry into this area. So students who have low vision taking a high stakes test. In the case of this study, we're going to look at the mainstream entrance test for high school education. So at the end of this primary school, the time that I was looking at, students in the final year take a test that's designed by the school itself. It's an in-house test, and that's used to gauge whether the school feels to mainstream education for secondary school, and the parents. It's a high stakes test for that purposes because they really, really want to get into mainstream education or need to in a lot of cases. So this test, we're going to look at the English section today. It's actually multidisciplinary. You've got maths, Hungarian, history. We're going to just think about the English part of it because that's what I was involved in. 100 marks in total, 10 sections. It's about an hour long. The test does reflect what they've learned in the syllabus. There's quite a lot of gap fill work and lexical work in there. It had some writing components. Speaking and listening were not assessed in this test. They're assessed more formatively throughout the year. And I've just put a quick note at the bottom there. It's beyond the scope of this to critique the test. Even though I did have some thoughts on that, I tried to not be too critical of the test itself, just for practical reasons, really. So these were the research questions we were looking at. How do visually impaired learners and their instructor feel about the test? How do they prepare for it? And what are the difficulties they encounter? So I wanted to give the students a chance to answer these, and also their very experienced instructor as well. This is in 2010, I'll just remind you. In order to do that, there was two main methods. We had classroom observations, semi-structured. So I went into these classes for 2 weeks as a researcher. I picked a class that was had children in their final few years. And the reason for that is because they were preparing for this entrance test. I observed them for about 20 hours in total, a couple hours a day. And I interviewed them too. This is where a bit of the Hungarian language came in. These children had very mixed English ability, so it would be unfair to interview them completely in English. So we did English where they could manage it, and also some Hungarian. with the help of a translator as well, I must say, for quite a short time, 30 minutes each, and a more in-depth one with the instructor. I analysed all that data using Brown and Clark semantic analysis. I did bring in the instructor to kind of act as a double coder there. It was really important not to misrepresent the views of the participants in this really specialised situation, or the context, which is not my own context I was coming into. So in terms of results, we got a list of the accommodations that were being used in this mainstream education entrance test. You can see them there in the list: coloured pencils, adapted paper. They had tilting desks, which came up and helped the students see better. A thing called spotlights, which were essentially using lights to help them see more clearly. Another one, CCTV stations. This is a magnified device. I mean, remember, you're going back to 2010, so things were a little bit more basic at that time. They had adapted print, specialised glasses, and perhaps most importantly, they had learning assistants. They were given a bit more time if they needed it. Actually, what we found is these accommodations in the test were pretty similar to the classroom environment, which is an encouraging sign. It wasn't the problem, the accommodations in the test. The problem is that it was still a very difficult test for students, and language proficiency was one of the biggest barriers. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, shouldn't language proficiency be the barrier? Around their vision. So in a way, although the accommodations helped them and didn't seem to overcompensate, because they certainly weren't all flying through this test, the other barriers were a little bit beyond that. We had some perspectives on the test itself. This was really interesting to gather. Most of the students I interviewed, remember there's about 11 of them, were pretty apprehensive about this mainstream education test, but they did really want to join. They just knew it would be really difficult for them, both in the test and beyond it. Quite a few of them called out writing as particularly challenging. And, you know, again, each candidate found to be very, very unique and individual in their characteristics and their views on the test. If we look here, we've got a couple of quotes. The first one is from one of these low vision students. The second one is from their teacher. Yeah.
Sì, però ne basta un bel lavoro,
I'm not talking about. Yeah, as you can see, it's quite sad to see you know, a young student like that worrying about sleeping on the street. And in fact, one of the students did sleep on the street for a while, or in a train station. Thankfully, he got out of that. But a lot of these kids are from very deprived backgrounds, socioeconomically. So what she was worrying about, you know, it's not an illegitimate worry. And what the teacher's saying a bit more positive there. In essence, she's saying that just because you are visually impaired doesn't mean that you can't learn a language, but it needs to be under the right conditions. And what she mentioned is, you know, a supportive family and the school. The school is such an important part. You need to be properly supported. You need to be, you know, have that kind of natural gift of intelligence anyway. And also the severity of sight loss had an impact on their chances as well. And then briefly, I went back to the school in 2021. Well, it was online, the pandemic. What I wanted to know is, have there been any changes around the entrance test experience, the whole thing since then? What are the implications of the changes? You know, this is over 10 years on. What I did was basically talk to the same instructor from last time, Mrs. Modar. She was about to retire, so nearly 40 years of experience. And I conducted 3 email interviews with students who had gone on to mainstream education to see how they were getting on, kind of unusual cases, plus a bit of desk research and looking at literature. So had the situation in Hungary changed since that time? What had moved on in the academic world? Essentially, on the surface, things had moved on. new inclusion legislation came in Hungary for SEN learners. After I conducted the first study, the Hungarian government had a kind of drive to help more of these students get into mainstream education. Unfortunately, from what I can see, it hasn't worked out so far like that. And the reason for that, Ms. Moddar said anyway, was a lack of proper training for the teachers, a severe lack of resources in these schools. So what's happening is it's kind of a sink or swim model. A lot of these students are being put into mainstream education now, but without the proper help that they need. And that means a huge burden falls on them. And I think quite a few of them are probably suffering. On the other hand, there are some successful cases, and we know how important inclusion is, but it has to be properly supported. That's what she's saying here. Computer-based learning has also grown a lot. You'd imagine, you know, that's not a surprise since 2010. That can be very helpful for low vision students if it's used correctly. I've got 3 high school student vignettes there, so these students basically wrote up how they were getting on. One of them was from the original study, and he'd actually gone on to do very well. He'd been part of a university and actually got a master's degree. He was working in IT. This is a guy, when I met him, he'd had a stroke at birth. He walked with a stick. He had low vision. He had all kinds of challenges, but he was smart and hardworking, and his family really helped him. So it's quite nice to see those success stories, but we shouldn't be distracted by the fact that, to me, it looks like these inclusion policies at the moment are, there's work to be done. But in conclusion, I think a fair question would be, is this inclusion in name only? And what I mean there is, or Ms. Moddar means, it's not enough to just change the policies. Money needs to go into it as well. I think Hungary invests one of the lowest amounts in education in Europe, but I understand that it's difficult there, but throwing the students in without that extra support it might make it more difficult for a lot of them. These are complex issues. I don't have all the answers to them, but just to kind of finish off, I'm not nearly out of time, but one thing I found is there's kind of conflicting positions in here. So the academic perspectives, from what I can see, were encouraging a drive towards conclusion. The teacher in this study, I think she was apprehensive about inclusion without the proper resources. And now see, actually, I don't think that is a conflict. That's that very experienced instructor saying, if you're going to have inclusive education, you must put in the proper support, or low vision students and other SEN students are going to suffer. And then another conflict I saw here is, to be honest, the Hungarian government policies versus reality. And that's where I think some of the power asymmetry comes in. The policy shouldn't just be lip service. And I don't want to be too down on that, but it's important that a lot of work, you know, remains to be done here. But it's for the sake of the students more than anyone. I hear stories of families having to provide a lot of the resources and equipment, and that's not right either. But so probably more questions than answers that come out of this presentation. But we have also got a couple of limitations just before I stop. So the sample size was quite small. You have to bear in mind it was just one class and one teacher. So yeah, we bear that in mind. Also, it's difficult to generalize from a study about really complex issues like this, because it is quite specific to each learner, as I said. There's methodological challenges. I mean, email interviews is not something I would choose. I would like to speak to these students in their own language to find out what's going on. But actually, they said we're busy. These high school students, can you just send us an email? We'll give you your thoughts. So I had to be a little bit flexible. And there is quite a bit of literature out there now. I think if I was designing the study again, I would probably make that part of the research questions in terms of how these students are getting on. There is a manuscript coming out which goes into more detail. I've got loads of findings from that initial study in particular, but basically there is more research to be done. This is a longitudinal study, even though it kind of put together backwards in a sense. But I would suggest it'd be great to have more studies on low vision students and how they go through each stage of education. There are a few out there in university settings, but there's nothing that I could find that tracks them all the way. And something with maybe a bit more mixed methods than just the qualitative would be good as well. I'd love to know what's happening in bigger numbers and in different countries. But I'm aware I've gone over my time, so if anyone would like to see these references, let me know, I can send them on.
Great, thanks, Tony. And you haven't gone over time. We actually still have 6 minutes for questions before we pause for a little break. There were a couple comments in the chat. There's still time to put in some questions for Tony if you want to. Another comment just came in. So a comment from Carmen saying, I feel so sorry for the Hungarian students. And from Judit saying, yes, Tony, you're right about investment in education in Hungary. There is not even a dedicated ministry for education, and the Minister of Inner Affairs, the former owner of a security company, is responsible for education. I don't know if you want to say anything to that. And then, yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think it's clear there's a lot of work to be done there. And I'm glad it's not just, I mean, people have written about this in the literature. I think it's great if we can shine a bit more of a light on it.
And another comment from Irene saying, my student wants to take her test using a Braille sense machine instead of having a CBT exam and a human reader, but my institution doesn't allow that. So yes, I suppose there are alternative accommodations that just aren't accepted yet. I would like to just return to a question from Roy, which was originally for Judith, but I think there's a strong overlap here, and it's focused on the technology being a barrier actually for the test. And I think this, for me, this is interesting with your study. If it's computer-based and maybe they're low income, then but Roy's question was actually about a student wanting to visual impairment in which prolonged exposure to a screen causes pain and difficulty in viewing. And the test center offered longer time, but of course that wasn't what they wanted, the test candidate. So his question was whether there are more adaptations for these types of learning difficulties. And I suppose IELTS has an offline testing alternative.
Yeah. Oh, there's quite a lot in there. I think that's all right. I think technology can definitely play a part here. It looks to me like we've not, as the assessment community, we've not cracked it yet in terms of how it can help these kind of students. When you can see the cases brought up in the chat box, I'm very, very sympathetic to each of them, whether it's about the Braille machine in that example or the other examples like IELTS. I think all of these big tests and smaller tests could probably do a bit better. There are guidelines and policies in place for what to do, but I know there's work going on in the case of IELTS, for example. In the background, we've got researchers working on how we can improve the use of testing accommodations. It looks to me like across different assessments at the moment, although we do have policies, it seems a little bit ad hoc. I think it'd be great to make sure everyone gets the fairest chance. And I agree with what Judith was saying earlier. There must be a way to give an overall school score to a student. You know, I think it's just about finding how to do that fairly. Again, just returning to one of the earlier points, I remember a study about a Braille machine, and it broke down. The student was using it and it broke down. And I remember the best way to find out what to do next was to ask the student, because she knew, you know, okay, this isn't working, I can do it like this. And that came out in my study as well. Sometimes we don't have the solutions. sometimes the students themselves can really help.
Yes, absolutely. That's definitely the case for EALTA special accommodations. We tend to ask the test taker what has worked for them in the past and what they would prefer. Richard, did you want to add?
No, I was just saying
anything?
maybe this is something that we can pick up on later, because this is a really big topic, actually. The sort of the extent to which test providers have to kind of offer a standard to people, and how it's sometimes difficult to offer those individualized kind of accommodations that people might need. But then again, yeah, on the other side, you've got the very genuine need of people. And how much can we actually cater to each person individually? Because obviously everybody's needs are different. And different tests of the major tests, different ones sort of address it in different ways. But there's a lot of, obviously there's a lot to talk about sort of around that issue.
Yeah, and we could talk for hours, couldn't we? But we will
Sure.
have a bit more time at the end of the session. That concludes the time for Tony. Thank you again, Tony. Again, feel free to use the reactions. I'd love to see the little clapping hands. And we will pause now for 10 minutes. We'll be back at 20 minutes past the hour with the third presentation. So thanks again to the first two presenters, and see you in a few minutes. So I hope you had a nice break and welcome back. For our third presentation, I'll be welcoming Joanna Nijakowska. I hope I'm pronouncing that close to correctly.
Hi.
Hello, lovely to see you. And Professor Dina Tsagari. We're very privileged to have you both talking about operationalizing inclusion and accessibility in language education, universal design and accommodation. So feel free to take over sharing the screen. If that's not possible, Richard, maybe you could stop sharing so the button appears. Just give it a moment.
Dina, do you want me to share the screen or will you do that?
Yes, Joanna, please do that from your end. Just
Okay.
briefly to say hello and Happy New Year to everyone. We didn't have the
Happy New Year
opportunity
to you as
to
well.
share wishes while Joanna is uploading the slides. I must say that me and Joanna are very happy to be here today presenting a project that is very much informed and by all the discussions we just had, and we hope it comes in good time, maybe perhaps to address some of the issues that have already been discussed. So I'd like to give the floor now to Joanna to start this presentation. And there's going to be a lot of information, actually, even though the project is halfway through. We would like first to start with backgrounding the project. There's going to be a level of detail for some of you might be interesting. For others, please be patient. But we would like to say that the project is halfway through, so we're going to be sharing a lot of the achievements of the project with you, but also we're going to give you a lot of information of what comes next. So, Joanna, the floor is yours.
Okay, just could you please confirm that you can see the presentation okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so let's try. I must admit that I'm using Teams for the first time because we usually work with different tools, but I hope I'll manage. Okay, how to do this? Okay, it seems it works. Okay, so I would like to start with a short rationale for the project and why we decided to do the project in the first place, and what research outcomes actually told us what's important and why we wanted to work in this field. So in a number of studies that both of us, Dina and I, but also Judit participated, we found out that first of all, foreign language teachers report that the level of preparedness to work with students with special educational needs, including students with specific learning difficulties, is unsatisfactory. So they feel they do not know enough, they do not know how to work. And this also applies to principles of universal design and inclusive education and creating equitable learning environments. So that's what we know from research. And also the second thing that teachers confirm is the need for training. So this is a very clear voice from teachers that we can hear. And then also in different sets of studies, we try to figure out, okay, so if we have this sort of training, would it work? Would it improve teachers' perceptions of their knowledge and abilities and what they can do, or in other words, their preparedness to work with students with special educational needs and to cater in an appropriate way to those needs. And those research findings actually told us that in different modes of training, including the online training and face-to-face training, and also hybrid training with teacher trainees, this is effective. So those were the two major motivations for us to apply for the funding for this project. So let me now tell you about the education program. So this is the institution from which we got the funding. So the education program was signed by the three countries, and this is Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. And they decided to implement the European Economic Area financial mechanisms for the years 2014 and 21. And this European Economic Area financial mechanism actually represents the contribution of those three countries to the creation of green, competitive and inclusive Europes. And these are basically those three main strengths that projects can address and that they can get funding for. So as you know, we addressed the last one, the inclusive Europe. And the Fair Education Program, the overall objective that they have is to reduce the economic and social disparities in the European Economic Area, and also to strengthen the bilateral relations between Poland and institutions from the three donor countries. And the objectives are and how to implement those inclusive green and competitive Europe is through professional development of staff working in education, but also through students and higher education institutions, staff mobility between Poland and donor countries, and institutional partnership. And this is what we actually set up with Dina. So we do have this partnership between Oslo Metropolitan University and University of Warsaw. And then activities that can be undertaken as part of the education program, they include equalizing opportunities, non-discrimination, including accessibility for people with disabilities. This is what we concentrated on, but also other themes that would refer to anti-discrimination, social inclusion of vulnerable groups, and so on. So the priority areas, they have a number of priority areas, and the ones that we address in the project are in blue, so inclusive education, and finally, well, that leading to child welfare education, because we are addressing teacher training. So the project and its outcomes refer to teacher education, and this is pre-service teacher education, continuing professional development. And through educating teachers, we hope that the final beneficiaries of the products of our product will be students and children learning foreign languages. Okay, so you know how we got the grant, and there are two institutions involved. So this is the partnership between University of Warsaw and Oslo Met, and the project we'll be talking about is called Scaled, which is supporting content and language learning across diversity. We applied for a longer duration for 24 months, but that's to cut the long story short, they did not agree, and you're interested, I'll explain later on why. Nevertheless, we managed to keep in the plan the most important things that we wanted to do. So the three outcomes that we are going to talk about, as far as the name is concerned, it was important for us to address the needs not only of teachers working in primary and secondary education, but also academic teachers, and not only academic teachers that are involved in teacher training, but also those teachers who use English and other languages as medium of instruction. I think there is considerable interest among those teachers. At least this is what we know after our first dissemination event that we held at the University of Warsaw. Okay, and the education program that we got funding from, they have a number of components, and we address component number 4. And there are a number of activities that you can do in this component, and those that are in blue, these are the ones that we address in our project. So this will be development and updating of the educational offer, and this can include study programs and training courses, textbooks and guides, and this is what we concentrated on, and these are our outputs 2 and 3 that we are going to talk about later, and also exchange of experience and good practices. And we've conducted 2 workshops, and we produced outcome 1 that is completed, and you will also get the details a little bit later on. And finally, distance learning, and this will refer to our output 3, the major output, which will be the remote online course that will be freely available and this will be available from the Moodle platform of the University of Warsaw. And Dina, will you take over for the aims of the project?
giving you the aims of Scaled, our project, which is basically to develop a new online course that can be used interactively or as a self-study course. Depends really, of course, on the needs of those who will be using the materials in the fields of inclusive education, using universal design for learning, differentiated instruction, and methods of increasing the accessibility of the teaching process, content and materials in the context of foreign language teaching and education through language. So if you're looking for acronyms, EFL definitely, CLIL and EMI, English as a Medium of Instruction. The course will be part of the initial training and professional development, as Joanna said, of pre-service and in-service foreign language teachers and academic teachers, and it will be available as part of open educational resources on the Moodle platform of the University of Warsaw, and it will definitely be disseminated through various channels in the future, and the EDI SIG will definitely be a major dissemination channel for us. Next, please. Who are we? I think we are a group of very dedicated people with a high motivation and great interest in inclusive education. From the University of Poland, you have one of the two culprits, Joanna, with her amazing team, Eva, Mikal, Malgorzata, Dorothy from the Digital Competence Center, very dedicated people from the Office of Persons with Disabilities and the Institute of English Studies as well. On the other side, Oslo Metropolitan University is contributing with highly specialized teacher educators such as Astrid and Hege from the Department of Primary and Secondary Teacher Education, as well as Bernie, our special education colleague from the Department of Vocational Teacher Education, and also specialized personnel from the Faculty of Technology, Art, and Design, the Computer Science, Wei Jin and Norun, who have also trained us, I must say, in issues of universal design. They are the experts in the field. Next, please. And this is who we are. If you want to see the faces of the people who are behind the project, very proud. One picture is the entrance of our building at Oslo Met, and the other one at the Department of English Studies, University of Warsaw. Next, please. And of course, we have friends. We decided to have a specially dedicated webpage on the webpage of the project with friends, and this is just a handful of our friends who are supporting us either by attending the meeting. These are going to be a very supportive group of friends, and also I hope others in today will be motivated after this presentation to help us pilot the materials as well. We consider piloting a learning process, of course. Joanna, would you like to talk about the website?
Yes, please. We encourage you to visit our website, Scaled website, where you can find information about the project, its outputs, also our updates on partner meetings, workshop and conferences. So you can find all the necessary information about our dissemination events, as well as outputs. And outputs, I think, is the most important part of our website, because we make the project products available online as well, and they can be accessed both online and they can be downloaded. So far we are done with the first output, and you will hear about it in a second, and this can already be accessed through the website. Okay, let's move on with the details about the project output. So this is the summary of our activities. This project is not really packed with work packages or activities, as we call them here, because as I said, we had to reduce what we planned initially. Nevertheless, the most important elements were kept in the project. So obviously, this is project management, promotion and sustainability through a number of dissemination events and publications. But the most important things are point 2 and 3. So first of all, the exchange of experience of, and good practices, and the output that resulted from those exchanges is the report. And then the third activity is the development of this new educational offer that we mentioned, and this will be the course, but there are 2 outputs involved, the methodological guide and an online course, and we'll be talking in a little bit more detail about them in a second. We'll also be doing the pilot, so we need feedback on the materials, and then we'll still have some time to implement the changes before we publish those results and make them available to everyone. Okay, Dina, over to you.
Okay. Output 1. We're going to put a tick here because we're very happy that this has been accomplished in such a short time. As Joanna said, the application aimed for a 2-year project, but unfortunately we only got 14 months. However, we managed to put together a very important output, and this has to do with the guide. The starting point of the project was indeed the exchange of experiences and good practices among us concerning inclusive education, universal design, and of course, accessibility issues as well. And the result of that was the production of a report, including a catalogue of good practices, which took the form of a guide for educational authorities and decision makers. Of course, some of you might be interested, and we're going to share with you on the next slide some screenshots as well. In trying to exchange experiences and good practices among the members of the group, we organized 2 events, a seminar that took place at Oslo Met and a workshop later on. And the first event was more of a theoretically oriented event. Afterwards, aiming at collecting and developing a catalogue of appropriate effective practices and strategies, while the second workshop that took place at the University of Warsaw was more of a practical nature, where the participants of the event basically exchanged good practices in the field.
If I can interrupt here for a second, what you can see in those pictures are teaching aids printed on a 3D printer in our office for persons with disabilities, and the person who actually explained to us how to use them is our colleague, a member of our team, Zbyszek, who works for the Office of Persons with Disabilities in the University of Warsaw, and he's blind himself, and he is a proficient foreign language user. So it's pleasure to work with him, but also we learned a lot. And I would like to refer to what the previous speaker said, that nothing can be done really without those people for whom we are trying to design the course. So this is really a valuable experience for all of us that we have those people on board. Okay, moving on.
This is the guide. The guide is, of course, really accessible and downloadable from the website of the project. As you can see, the table of contents, we have 14 chapters, and definitely assessment is one of the chapters, but also very important milestones in understanding universal design in education and accessibility, especially for marginalized groups. And we would like to welcome you all to visit the website and download the guide, because surely there must be something there for each one of you. We made sure that all the chapters were peer reviewed, and there's loads, of course, of references to research and practice. And as I said before, the guide is divided in 2 parts, the more theoretical chapters and the chapters that contain a lot of good practical advice for a range of stakeholders, ranging from policymakers over to practicing teachers. So that's a valuable resource we think, for most of you and most of the stakeholders involved in this field.
Okay, moving on to output 2 and 3. They are connected because they both refer to designing the course. Output 2 will be a methodological guide with methodology behind the course, and also with all the activities that are going then to be translated into the digital form, and they become the part of the course that is available online via the Moodle platform. But we decided that we also need to have this document with as if the possibility for those users who need the printed version of the course. This will be possible to do, and this will be available in the PDF form, and the PDF will contain QR codes through which the users of printed versions may also access online materials that are embedded into the modules. And to do that, it's enough to have your mobile phone nowadays and scan with the camera. So this is what is planned for output 2, and then output 3 will be the online course, and this will be designed in a way so it can be used for self-study by teachers, academic teachers, anyone who would like to take advantage of it. But this can also be used for hybrid courses. For example, we run such hybrid courses at the University of Warsaw in the teacher training center, which means that we do some part of work in face-to-face sessions where we meet students, and we also have online sessions, and this is where we have our courses on the Moodle platform. So hybrid, that's what I mean here, and also for face-to-face, as I said. Okay, I think we've said the things. And the main objectives, as we mentioned, will be to follow the trends in teacher education. So the structure of the course is a set of modules, and those modules are built of tasks. So we use task-based instruction and teacher reflection. And as we mentioned, we'll incorporate the course into the educational offer at our universities. For example, the University of Warsaw will use it for professional development and for initial training of pre-service teachers of foreign languages, and also will offer courses for academic teachers who use foreign languages as means of instruction. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, the final beneficiaries, we hope, of the project will be the pupils and students learning a foreign language and or through a foreign language at different levels of education. The guide, the methodological guide that will include the description of the modules, this is something that we are currently working on. And as I said, this will be available online on the website, as well as interested parties can download it as a PDF document, and all the project outcomes are produced in English. Okay. And the online course, this will be part of the Moodle platform that we use at the University of Warsaw, and we negotiated with the Center of Digital Competences that they actually will secure enough space that can be accessed by external parties without barriers. So this is also extremely important that we have them on board to help us develop this and then manage and maintain the course on the Moodle platform so that it works properly and it can serve its purpose. There are two stages So first of all, once we are done with the methodological guide, we'll then translate the activities that we designed into the digital form, and we'll be placing the course on this distance learning platform. So we'll be digitalizing the materials, and we'll be preparing the content and materials in individual modules, and we have specially designed templates for this, and we'll be using all sorts of materials to make the content multisensory, multimodal, and we'll be including a number of accessibility features so that the materials are easily accessible to the widest possible group of users. Also, we'll be developing assessment tasks to verify the learning outcomes in terms of knowledge and skills. And the final step in this stage that will be conducted after the piloting phase will be making necessary changes resulting from feedback and conclusions after the pilot. And the second stage is the pilot itself, and we'll be piloting single modules in different modes, so face-to-face teaching or on-site meetings, and online with the teacher, and also piloting selected modules online in a self-study mode. And we'll be also teaching larger parts of the course as a part of the courses that we normally run that are compulsory. For example, at the University of Warsaw, we have a compulsory course in teacher training for students of the second year of the first circle on teaching learners with special educational needs. So we'll be piloting this course with them. Yeah, I think that more or less tells you what we want to do. So the pilot's very important for us, and we'll be involving scaled friends who already agreed to take part in the pilot stage and help us to improve whatever will need improvement. And every single module is structured according to the same principle and the same template. So there's exposure to input, then scaffolded practice, free practice, finally reflection, and I don't know what I meant here with increased accessibility, but what I tried to say here is that we'll be designing every single module so that it is as accessible as possible to a wide number of participants. So, for example, we'll be using educational technologies to make this accessibility even greater, with videos, with subtitles and transcription, and there will be all sorts of embedded accessibility features that participants of the course can decide whether they can use it or not. So they will be personalized, and we also use alternative text. So this is description of objects for screen readers used by blind persons. So these are just some of the examples of accessibility features that we'll be using in the course. Okay, and Dina, the course structure.
Right, the course will comprise of 10 modules, as you can see here. And I'm just going to go through the list very quickly, just to give you an idea of what there's going to be in this very ambitious, but at the same time motivating course. The first module is going to be titled Responding to Diversity Inclusion. We're going to have a module 2 on accessible learning, introducing universal design for learning. Module 3, accessible learning with accommodations toolkit. Modules 4 and modules 5, again, universal design for learning. We decided to split that in two because we felt that teachers needed to work on 2 modules instead of 1, because there's so much about universal design for learning. And also module 6, accessible online learning platforms. Module 7 is titled Making Language Education Accessible to Students with Special Educational Needs, such as ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, mental health disorders. Module 8, Making Language Education Accessible to Students with Special Needs, Visual Impairment and Blindness, will be the focus of this module. Module 9, we're going to focus on inclusive and accessible language assessment. So pretty much of the discussions that have been going on today hopefully will be reflected in that module. And module number 10, the final module, will be titled Making Language Education Accessible to Students with Special Educational Needs. Diverse language and cultural background and talented students will be the focus of this module. As Joanna said, we don't have to say much here, Joanna. The methodological guide is also part of this output. It's important to have a methodological guide because we feel that for not only to justify and describe the steps that we've taken, but maybe others might like to see what we've done and how we've done things, if inspired to take on and follow up on the work that we are now doing. Definitely on Moodle, and we are going to include an evaluation report as well from 2 external reviewers who very kindly and generously offered their time to provide an evaluation report at the end of the design and piloting. I'm not going to say much about piloting, Joanna, because I think you covered that slide, so we can move forward. Workshops. We've done a lot of meetings, as you can imagine. We had project meetings and workshops. As I said earlier, the first project meeting took place at Oslo Met, late May, beginning of June, along with a workshop. The second workshop took place in September at the University of Warsaw. A lot of good discussions, exchange of ideas, learning from each other, practice. A funny picture of me, sorry. I was being funny. And then we had a dissemination seminar combined with a project meeting at the end of November, beginning of December. More than 40 people, 40 were the number registered, but definitely more people came to that one. It was a hybrid meeting. We accommodated people online and face-to-face in the room. And the next slide, I think, is the one presenting the activities of that meeting and dissemination event. So if you're interested in finding out about the program, here is an example where you can see that we have Zoom meetings, and that was the list of presentations. Joanna is going to tell you a little bit of the way forward now.
Yes, and this is the final slide and invitation that we want to extend to all of you. We are planning the final conference where we'll be disseminating the results of the project, including the methodological guide and the course itself. 2-day conference, 15th, 16th June in Warsaw, in Poland, and you will find all details on our SCALE project website. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna and Dina. Fantastic presentation and amazing work. We did get a few comments agreeing. Somebody said great teaching aids. Another person said inspirational work. And thanks for sharing as well the link in the chat. We did get one question. I'm aware we're a couple minutes over time, but we have time. I'll just take a minute before I hand over to Richard to lead a general discussion. We did have one question specific to your presentation about the PDFs being accessible. So is that a step that you have taken or have thought about taking, making the PDFs accessible?
Well, yes, the PDF of the guide is accessible. You can visit the website and download the guide. It's really accessible. If this is the question.
Not accessible as in able to.
It's
not
downloadable. No?
By accessible. This is actually a comment or a question by Andrew Skinner, a colleague, who's specialized in making PDFs specifically accessible to certain minority groups, you know, that might have difficulty reading them, or there might be color issues, these types of accessibility questions actually. So that's another.
Yes, and we also plan to cover those issues in the 2 modules. So we have 2 separate modules on how to make all sorts of presentations and documents, including PowerPoint documents, anything that is digitalized, so that this is accessible to a wide range of users.
There's another comment by Andrew in the chat. Maybe you can continue this discussion offline. I am going to thank you again, and definitely a round of applause to both of you and all the presenters today. Thank you so much for your time and your lending your expertise to this platform. And I'll hand over to Richard and invite the other speakers to come back if they're here and willing.
Hi there, Judit. Yes, you're on mute. Thanks, Connie. Yep, you're on. So in this last section, we've just got about sort of 15 to 20 minutes before we need to go. So one of the themes that's come up during all the talks this afternoon, but particularly possibly in Judit's and in Joanna and Dina's presentation, is about kind of standards, guidelines, frameworks, the things that we use to kind of help us make better assessments or make better decisions in the classroom concerning different types of learners. There are quite a few documents around, published by various bodies. They are of differing levels of usefulness, I would guess, or approach the topic from very different perspectives. So I guess we'd like to have a sort of brief discussion now about what kind of standards and guidelines do we know about in the field, and what can we use them for, and which ones are the most useful for our purposes. Do we need any further guidance? Obviously, Joanna and Dina felt the need that there was a gap that they needed to fill with some of their work. So what further guidance do we feel that we need to have to inform our current and future assessment practice? I'd like to invite some of our speakers to make a kind of short contribution to this to get the ball rolling, and then please raise a hand if you'd like to speak or to ask a question or offer some benefit of your own experience. Please feel free to share things in the chat as well if you want to share links or resources. So Judit, would you like to?
Yes, so to start us off, I mean, I actually mentioned at the beginning of my presentation that I think the general standards from the APA, the Educational Research Association in the US, they are useful in the sense that they outline the main theory and the theoretical considerations. And I think there are the basic principles that, you know, everyone who offers language tests should follow. And we saw in the chat examples where institutions are actually clearly violating guidelines. So I think in that regard, those theoretical guidelines are very helpful. Then we have the Universal Design and Accessibility Guidelines that are, you know, come from two different sources that I mentioned in my presentation. I think they are also useful, although some aspects are not generally applicable to language tests or only to certain parts of language tests or limited components. And I think we should do more work on trying to actually do these expert evaluations and take those guidelines and sit down and analyze our language tests systematically to see where you know, our tests are perhaps violating those guidelines, and what additional guidelines we should, or additional criteria we should add that are specific to language assessment. So that's my kind of second suggestion. And then we obviously need to also consider other issues of accessibility that are not in the guidelines per se, or kind of hidden in the guidelines, issues that I have mentioned about you know, being able to access accommodations with certificates of disabilities, issues with visually and hearing impaired candidates with different modifications, involving test takers in identifying specific barriers in the test, and then negotiating that with test providers. So I think we should probably aim for designing clearer guidelines. Obviously, it will be difficult to design guidelines that are applicable across a range of context and also across a range of disabilities or special needs. Yeah, I think we have some basis to start from.
Okay, thanks, Judit. Tony, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree. I was just thinking about the various language tests out there and what they do. I mean, I mentioned ad hoc earlier. I think probably quite a lot of assessment providers are thinking of accommodations. It looks to me like they're not particularly joined up at the moment. So I would also very much welcome some guidelines to help there. I think something that was possibly mentioned was a role for EALTA and UCALTA, you know, in that, and using our expertise to hopefully inform the field. I was just wondering if EALTA has their set of guidelines and if there's something we could draw on from that.
Yeah, there is EALTA do have a set of guidelines. I haven't looked at them very recently, so I couldn't tell you about them in detail, but they are kind of quite useful and more at a theoretical level, I would say, than at a practical level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It could be good to look back at those and see if we can add something complementary, probably. I know it's a slightly different context, but I imagine they've also put some thought into this. So yeah, I totally agree, actually. But I think another challenge is, what do you then do once you've got the guidelines? I'm just very apprehensive that sometimes these things get a little bit overlooked once they've been made, but it's a good first step to think about what they would look like.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Yeah, some interesting things in there. Dina, Joanna, you got
just
anything you'd like to say?
Definitely guidelines, and especially addressing international standards is one thing to go for, but we know very well that when it comes to addressing context and local needs is another thing. So I was wondering, to the extent that we need to be careful localizing standards in a way, or at least allowing whatever standards and whatever guidelines we come up with within the EDI SIG or other SIGs, we need to consider making them, or at least allowing accessibility for localization, because sometimes local context might not be able to follow because they don't have the resources or the means or the capacity or competence to be able to address all the expected guidelines. So we need to be a little bit careful there not to overdose, but at the same time make the guidelines accessible and easy to be used, depending really on the context and its capacity. So that's from me.
Okay, thanks, Dina. Joanna, anything you'd like to add to that? Oh, you're on mute. We can't hear you, Joanna.
Terribly sorry for this. Okay, my area is teacher training, and in teacher training, obviously, we cover assessment as well. So for me, as a teacher trainer, what's important is to have access to those clear guidelines. Why? Because I assume that no matter how we want to universally design, we'll not be able to make it throughout the test. This is what Judit mentioned. So accommodations will still be in place. And I think that our students who practice first those accommodations in the classroom and through informal assessment will be better off than when they will be taking high stakes exams where those accommodations will be provided for them. We can assume that we'll be designing with the universal design in mind, but I think that parts of it will have to be accommodated, at least for some learners in some contexts. And this is important that this is also translated to teacher training so that they know how to prepare students for those assessments. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. So if anybody would like to ask any questions of our speakers or would like to make a comment and join in discussion. This is supposed to be something everybody can contribute to. Please raise a virtual hand, and we can hear about your experiences in this area. I guess everybody's a little bit shy at the moment. One thing that I think that you picked up on, Tony. Oh, do we have? Okay, yes. Is that sorry, is that pushed? Yeah.
Pushpalata.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you unmute yourself? Ah, yes.
Yes. I'm Pushpalata from India, and I thank all the speakers. It was really, all the sessions were very insightful. I was just wondering that, when we are talking about visually impaired, students, or especially, abled students, and we are talking about inclusivity. That's a very good idea, but when it comes to, higher education, I think we have a lot of challenges, um, when it comes to adult teaching. Uh, so I just wanted to understand that in the project that you have taken just the school children, or you have, you know, in this project, all sets of students were taken into consideration. So this is my question.
Okay, anybody want to comment on that? So the kind of age range of students that we deal with and do research with.
Sure. I think it's a good point. I mean, university contexts bring new challenges. We know how much of a step up that is for anybody, let alone people with visual impairment. I don't think that means we should shy away from conducting research on it, of course. In my own study, I focused on primary school children, but as I said, it'd be great to find out a bit more what happens later. We've got research missing at each stage. There has been some work done in the university context, particularly in the US, some in the UK. It'd be great to add to that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, because English is taught to adults as well when they are speaking their native language. English is taught as a second language, and especially to the especially able children, adults. So I was just a little curious to understand that how what way it can be done. So thank you. I think a lot of work can be done even in that area when it comes to, bringing inclusivity for those adults also in education.
Okay, thanks for your question, Bush. Did you want to comment on that? You've done a lot of work with younger learners, especially.
Yes, so most of my work has been with younger learners, primary school children, and lower secondary school children. So, but I think a lot of the issues that test takers with SPLEs face are similar across the lifespan. Of course, there are specificities about adults and university students. Also, because actually those who get admitted to higher education, they already have very good, probably self-regulation, test-taking strategy, self-regulation skills and test-taking strategies. Because unfortunately, a lot of the students with SPLEs actually, some of them might even drop out of primary education, depending on where you kind of draw the line for primary education. For example, in Hungary, primary education ends at the age of 14. And I know in other countries it is different. So if you look at the proportion of students with SPLEs as a progression across their system of education, the proportion drops as you get to higher education. So there you will see students who've got maybe less severe SPLEs, very high IQ, for example, that compensates for some of their weaknesses, and very good self-regulation strategies, etc. So, but it is really important to examine how students with SPLDs face barriers with language tests in higher education contexts, because in a lot of contexts, such as Italy, for example, language tests can act as a barrier for further progression, because you have to pass a language test to get your university degree. Again, just to take the example of Hungary, for a long time, they just did away with the law. You couldn't get a university degree without having passed the language exam at the B2 level. Now that has been done away with, but it is really important to consider that population. So there is a lot of research that we need, and more interviews with students and teachers. And we have some really good, good practices, for example, from Italy, that I heard being presented at conferences, but they are just not shared that widely. Yeah.
Yeah, I know this was not under the purview of your project, but I was a little curious to understand. So that's how I kept it. Thank you so much. It was really interesting, very enlightening, and I myself have learned so much from these sessions. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
It was really amazing.
I think
Thanks to
there's
all the.
sorry, push. Oh, she's gone. Okay, I was just going to mention there's a couple of comments in the chat. Nicole makes a very good comment where she says universities are more or less privileged. If students manage to get to higher education, then they've certainly developed strategies and know what can help them. So we have, when people get to university, these are the successful students who were saying, people who've developed the strategies to kind of deal with the education system and their own needs. So that's kind of explains some of the reason why the emphasis tends to be on researching younger learners. And nice comment there from Linda Taylor. Thank you for your encouraging words. And comments about increased stakeholder engagement across the board, which is nice. Thank you very much for that. I would like to carry on, actually, because I wanted to ask about computer-based testing. That's something that you mentioned, Tony, and whether we feel that we're, prepared, to provide sort of computer-based assessment, as pretty much, most assessment is online or is going online at the moment. I wonder if there's a gap there that that we feel that we need to be informed on. Is there maybe a last word on that, because that's quite an important sort of aspect of the work that we're doing at the moment.
Yeah, just to comment on that, we have this issue of intersectionality. So we might have students who have SPLDs, but also come from underprivileged backgrounds. And if you look at us researchers, we are all from Europe, right? Working in contexts where children have access to computers, laptops, them in schools. And very little research being conducted, for example, India or Sri Lanka, where, for example, power cuts are frequent and computers aren't available in the classroom. And at best, the students have a mobile phone as an electronic device, and that's it. And we know very little about what barriers these students face, particularly if they have special educational needs or SPLDs. We take it for granted that technology will make a test more accessible, and in many respects it will, because it allows, for example, one element of universal design is optionality. So let's say stopping the recording or choosing how you want to hear or read the instructions. But it is also part of fairness that students have opportunities to prepare for the test. They are familiar with the tools that deliver that test. And again, remote proctoring, we really need to look into that. What kind of barriers that presents to students with SPLDs and different students with special educational needs, because that has important implications as well.
Anybody else? A last word maybe on that before we close?
Yeah, I agree. It looks to me like there's still quite a lot of work to be done because online proctoring is quite new for many tests. I think we have to be a bit careful in terms of balancing security needs of these high stakes tests with the accommodations we can provide. As Roy, I think, put in the comment, is a really good point, but that doesn't mean it can't be done.
Okay. Thanks, Tony, and thanks. So, Dina, sorry, did you want to have?
Yeah, I just want to basically support Tony in what he just said. A lot more work needs to be done, and a lot more training and awareness raising around these issues from not just bottom up, the teachers and those who are involved in the language testing and assessment arena, but also way above policymakers and those who can make decisions around these issues. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of practice, but also in terms of helping others understand why this is a very important area as well.
Thanks, Dina, and thanks, everybody. I'm conscious of time, so we have to kind of close now. I'm sure we could carry on a lot more, and we may find other opportunities to do so. I would just like to say an enormous thank you to our speakers this afternoon, to Judit, to Tony, to Dina, to Joanna. There was really interesting presentations. Thank you to everyone who's been able to attend this afternoon. So Gemma has been busy putting lots of links and things in the comments for you to pick up on. So do join EALTA again and join our SIG. Share resources with us that you find useful. You can become a member of our team's EDI SIG channel, and we can share resources there. Gemma's provided the link. Our next event will be in Helsinki in Finland at EALTA 2023. We are hoping that's going to be a face-to-face event. If you are able to make it there, we would love to see you. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks again.
Take care.
And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.